You may or may not be amazed at how similar the service procedures are between multiple different 4-stroke engine brands. Believe it or not, they are all basically the same, and we're going to show you how. Just like the 2-stroke service items, a 4-stroke engine requires all the same service items no matter what brand it is. They all require oil, an oil filter, spark plugs, thermostats, engine fuel filters, boat water fuel separators. Most will have a belt, anodes, grease points, water pump impellers, and gear lube. We're going to do a service on a Yamaha F115 4-stroke as well as a Mercury 115 4-stroke just to compare the procedures. The first thing we want to do is pull the dipstick, clean it off, and reinstall it to check the oil level. Like on this Merc, there wasn't even any oil on the dipstick, and then on the Yamaha, the oil level was a little high. If you don't see any oil on the dipstick, it might be a good idea to go ahead and do a compression check on the engine just to be sure there's nothing wrong. And last week's video was all about compression tests, so we won't cover that here today. We'll go ahead and drain the oil out of the engine now after checking it. And all outboards have an oil drain plug somewhere on the engine. Like on these mid-sized 115s on the Merc, it's here on the port side of the midsection. Then on the Yamaha, it's here on the back of the engine. You can use a piece of the oil filter box as a way to funnel the oil on the Merc, or like on the Yamaha, a piece of bilge hose works great to drain out the oil into a bucket. While that's draining, we can go ahead and change out the oil filters that will be mounted somewhere on the power head. You've got to be careful with these filters though that are on the side like this, because they generally make a mess when you take them off. Then we can clean the surface where the filter goes and install the new filter with a little bit of oil or grease on the seal to make it easier to get off next time. You'll also notice that on a 4-stroke, once we get the ignition coils or coil leads off the spark plugs and get the plugs pulled out of the engine, they can develop this burn mark around the bottom of the ceramic on the plug here. Once this gets to this really burnt looking base and the tips also look burnt up, it's time to change out the plugs. When installing the new plugs, put a little bit of anti-seize or something on them just to help on pulling them out next time. But just a little bit, you don't want to go overboard with it, just a little bit goes a long way. Next up, we'll change out the thermostat, which as you can see, this is a perfect example of why you want to at least check the thermostats every other year. It doesn't take much for them to stick, and then once they get stuck like this, they can begin to build up salt and start to eat out parts of the housing where the thermostat sits. Not to mention that this thermostat was stuck open anyway. Though many of you probably live in freshwater areas where you don't even have to deal with anything like this, so this is irrelevant to you. But after installing the new thermostat, we'll move on to changing out the engine-mounted fuel filters. Some engines, like our Yamaha, will have a cup that you can unscrew, and then it will have the fuel filter inside the cup. You might notice how brown and discolored this filter is. That's a good sign that it's time to change out the filter. Then on the Merc, it actually has 2 fuel filters on the engine. The trick to these is also just like the trick to getting the canister filter off of the HPDI that we showed you a couple weeks ago in the 2-stroke video. You just have to push in on the filter, then depress the red tab here on the hose, and then we can pull the hose off of the filter and dispose of the filter. When installing the new filter, just make sure that the arrows are pointing towards the fuel injectors as well. Now the grease points on the 4-stroke are basically the same as the 2-strokes. There are the points on the bracket here, and then one on the midsection, and depending on the brand or model, you might find some grease fittings on the handles. Just a couple of pumps of grease will do fine, and we can move on to changing out the boat water separators, which if they look as rusty as this, you might want to think about setting a reminder to change it out a little more often. When it comes to the water separators, you can see why they are so valuable whenever you take it and dump it out into a clear jar, and you can see all the debris that gets collected in them. Then, just like the two-strokes, we want to top off the power tilt and trim reservoirs, and then we'll want to check the anodes on the brackets and change them out if they need to be changed. Also, don't be shy with the grease whenever you put the anode bolts back in as well. Now the only thing left to do is pull the lower units and service them. You want to pull the prop off first, and then there will be bolts on the sides of the lower unit, as well as a bolt up under the trim fin anode here. We do have videos on completely resealing the lower units, but a couple of main tips to look at whenever you do a service on a lower unit, like on these Yamahas. This top seal cover that goes above the drive shaft carrier seals, if you can pull the rubber off the metal like this, then it's time to replace it. Then if you see the springs on the seals broken or rusty like this, then we've got to pull the carrier and replace these seals, which isn't hard to do. With a couple of big flathead screwdrivers, you can pry up evenly on both sides of the carrier and get it to come up. But be careful not to lose the shims or the bearing race that are underneath the carrier. Now just stick the carrier in a vise and pry out the old seals. Clean up the carrier and press in the new seals with a socket, and we can grease up the O-ring and reinstall the carrier with the new seals. Now just grease everything up as you reinstall the water pump impeller and the water pump housing assembly. With fresh gear lube in the lower unit and everything serviced, we can grease up the lower unit and reinstall it onto the engine with the gear case in neutral. Make sure to line up the shift shaft and slide it back up into the midsection. We'll reinstall all of the bolts and the prop, and now give you a sneak peek into next week's video, where we are taking out a 35-foot motion and braking 100 miles per hour on the water. So don't forget to subscribe to the channel because you don't want to miss that. Thanks for hanging out with us this week, and we look forward to seeing you next week.